well, and we're hoping to have a really fascinating discussion and insights on the social sector and how it can rethink and rebuild through and beyond COVID. And I think it's very timely discussion we're having. And do please feel free to add. This is a sharing and collaboration conversation. It's not kind of a set presentation. It's more to hear from all of us and to be part of a conversation that will develop and grow. But before we start, the traditional housekeeping bits. So you've seen them on the slide below, but I think you also need to know that the event is being recorded and journalists are present. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please turn off your video. And also, you can put your questions in the chat and so on, if that's more convenient for you. The hashtag for the event is #RethinkRebuild for the social media geniuses amongst us, and I'm not one of them. And we, as I said, we'd like to encourage discussion. So do please add to the Zoom chat questions. We'll pick and choose because there's so many participants. I think we won't be able to answer all the questions, but we can capture them. But do put your questions down as we go along so that we can actually get your input. As I said, it's an ongoing conversation and thinking piece. So for those like me who are new to the NPC, I was going to say New Philanthropy Capital, but I struggled to wrap my lips around that. So the short time will be NPC. When I say that, no, it's for New Philanthropy Capital. And it's the think tank and consultancy for the social sector. And NPC does rely on funding and support and various kinds of investments and sponsorship to drive forward the improvements we like to see in the sector. So for this session, we acknowledge and are grateful to all the current donors and funders, and particularly the Gatsby Foundation who are supporting this one. And I'm really, really excited, particularly as a new trustee to NPC. So don't take me as a font of all knowledge on NPC. I've excitedly come on board. But I think it's a very timely thing through COVID and post-COVID, particularly for those of us who have been very, very concerned around what the sector is going to look like, what are the changes and challenges we need to do, and particularly those of us who think it can't be business as usual. So this Rethink Rebuild program, I think, is a very exciting program, and look at how we rebuild the economy and social fabric after COVID and other things, I have to say, but I don't want to go into other silos on that one. And also looking at systemic changes. And personally, one of the things I'm very interested in, particularly when you look at some of the things we've been looking at, like Black Lives Matter, been looking at the Brexit impact, COVID impact, and things going around the world, is many of these things are systemic. And so system change is a central part of it. So how we look at particularly our sector, the voluntary and community sector, social enterprise sector, to my mind, and what are the challenges we face and how do we go forward with it. So this bit of work, I think, is fascinating from that perspective and quite important. So at this event, what the team are going to do is share the thoughts and findings from the first phase of this work, which started in March. And they've been talking to various organizations, getting inputs, looking at the environment, and have some thoughts which they will present to us, some initial thoughts which they'll present on it. And looking at how we can respond to create a more equitable and effective sector for the long term. And so part of this event is really asking those who are participating and those of you who are kindly helping us to actually share these thoughts, to work with NPC, work with us, and to work together and collaborate to actually get the best thinking and the best experience to actually begin to shape where we go from here. And to that end, do feel free to pose for us the questions and challenges that we have to address or have to think about, or things that you think might not be quite, might be able to be tuned better or get better solutions. So with that in mind, you would have had me speaking to friend and colleague, Lord Victor Adebowale, who will be our first keynote speaker, our first speaker. Victor is a commercial and social entrepreneur who has devoted his career to building and leading organizations that improve the well-being of communities and people. Victor also really has had a long experience of some of the challenges we're talking about in the past and must have some good thoughts about going forward. He's recently stepped down from the NHS England board. And I don't want to reel all Victor's background and experience. I really want to hear from him. So Victor, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. It's great to see you, Albert, and I think New Philanthropy Capital, very lucky to have you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. I will be brief, and apologies to people who I'm in my gym kit. One of the good things about being a recovering chief exec is that I've got a bit more time to look after myself.
And Victor, you have 10 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes of questions.
Right. Yeah? Okay. That's great. I have been observing how people, how the sector has responded to the crisis with a lot of interest, and I think we are. Look, right now as we speak, I'm the chair of NHS Confed. We have 30,000 daily cases, 30,597 daily cases of COVID. We've got 8,340 people in hospital, and today 201 people have died so far. And it is, but make no mistake, the crisis is not over. I know that there's a kind of sense that we've beat the COVID. It is not over, and the implications of the COVID crisis will last long into the future. And I think one of the things that as sort of people need to be aware of is that there is a new normal, whether we like it or not. You can't have that many people die, and the impacts that on the economy, work, health, and it not change the way the future is designed and the way in which we operate. That, and in fact, I would argue that there are two kind of competing tensions in response to the crisis. The first is, the notion of getting back to a normal pre-crisis, 9 to 5, excuse me, hay fever, 9 to 5 jobs, assuming that the economy will be the same and we can do things the same, and we can't respond to the massive inequality gap that this crisis has shown up between rich and poor, between black and white, between geographical areas, as though that doesn't exist, as though we can somehow kind of just get back to normal in a really conservative, small c way. And then there's another view, which is that everything's changed. From the way we see ourselves as a society, from the way public services and services to the public have to be designed and delivered, to the way the economy needs to be engineered and led, to our relationships between ourselves in this country, but also our relationships across the world. And the social sector, for want of a better word, I don't like the word voluntary sector, because basically most people in it aren't volunteer. They work, but most people in this conference are working. And it implies that it's not professional. So I prefer to use the not for dividend sector, because it incorporates things like social enterprises, and you are effectively businesses with different aims. But what you are as a sector has not really been acknowledged in the discourse about post-pandemic world, or how we move into a post-pandemic world. There are reasons for that, but what I've noticed is in many communities, it's been the not-for-dividend sector that has provided the cohesion, that has provided people in some cases with food, with economic viability, with access to the vaccines, with the social infrastructures that stop people from falling through the net. To use a phrase, someone said to me that the not-for-dividend sector has been the spider's web that has turned into a net to catch people, rather than a net to trap people, rather than a web to trap people. And the question for me is how we can make that visible politically, so it becomes part of the way we move forward. So if you think about it, the reason why we have the NHS, the reason why we have social housing in this country is because it was started by the not-for-dividend sector during a period of long-standing crisis, which led to the politicians noticing that, you know what, we do need a health service, we do need a social housing service, we do need a welfare state. And I think the shifts that have occurred during COVID are no less massive. And the question is, can the sector lead the society? Can it present society with new forms of leadership and new forms of service that will actually sustain the future post-COVID? Because there's no going back, in my view. So I think there are a number of things that are pretty critical to this. And when I'm the chair of Collaborate works closely with NPC, which is one of the reasons why I agreed to do this. And the reason why I set up Collaborate was because I felt that we weren't collaborating enough in the provision of services to people, particularly those at the sharp end of the inverse care law. The inverse care law states that those in need of health and care the most, but read any public service the most, tend to get it the least, right? So I felt that we need to do something about that, and I think what's happened in the COVID crisis has made that point even more stark. But it seems to me that the following things are necessary, and then I'll shut up. First of all, we need to re-engage and refocus on place and localism and community. But we need to do that in a systemic and organized way. In order to do that, we need the kinds of leaders that understand system leadership and understand the characteristics of system leaders. I won't go into what system leadership is because I don't have a lot of time, but if you want to know, read the excellent paper by Peter Senge called The Dawn of System Leadership, which is basically, for me, it's the omphalos of what system leadership is. But we need leaders in the sector that have an open mindset, that understand diversity, and not just as a moral good, but as an essential economic and operational good, that can build relationships of trust outside and beyond the boundaries of their own organization, that practice effective communication beyond the boundaries of the organization, that focus on outcomes and data that lead to outcomes and processes that feed clear intention rather than just process. And you all know what I mean. Process that matches intention, that can co-create structures with communities and understand the 4 critical rules of community engagement, which, to be blunt, I'll tell you what they are. Listening, and listening is not easy. If I tell you I'm listening, you need evidence that you've been heard, right? You need a transfer of power such that the people that you're engaging with can do something during and after the engagement they couldn't do before. At worst, the outcome of the service or the design of the service needs to be co-produced. That's at worst. At best, it's produced by the people who receive the service. The NHS is the best example I can think of that notion. And finally, the service or intervention or change has to be describable within that community to the mothers, brothers, lovers, friends, in such a way that it's used. There's a reason why people go to A&E. It says what it does on the tin, right? And that shift in leadership within the sector is critical. And I think unless we get it, then I think there's a danger that we'll be kind of swept aside or taken for granted as a luxury good rather than a societal necessity. So I think the social enterprise world, the charitable not for dividend world need to be seen to be working together. We're all businesses now, and our product is sustainable communities fundamentally. COVID crisis is a wake-up call to the country, to the world about how we need to live going forward. The not-for-dividend sector has many of the values and the skills that can build the right scaffolding around that way of living going forward. we just have to be confident enough. You have to be confident enough. We have to be confident enough to make the case and to get the right leadership in place. And I'll end there.
Okay, thank you, Victor. I'll ask people to send in their questions, but as chair's prerogative, Victor, I have one for you. One of the key challenges I've drawn out of what you have said is, can the sector lead society? I like that, and I think that's a lot of food for thought behind that. But for this piece of work, what challenge will you throw down to NPC in terms of this rebuild piece of work? What would you challenge us to either consider or progress with?
Yeah, I think the challenge I would throw down to most organisations these days, but certainly to NPC, is to lead systemically. In other words, to lead beyond the boundaries of your own organisational need, which is not easy to do. It sounds great, but actually it's counterintuitive to the way many organisations and many leaders think. They think that actually the boundaries of their organisation is the only way that they can succeed and compete. Actually, the opposite's the case. I think the more that you can convene, influence, collaborate, the more likely you're going to get value. And where you've got limited resources, actually competition wastes them more than anything else. So that's what I would say NPC could and should be doing.
Okay. Are there any questions from participants that I can pose to Victor? So, Victor, again, I'll take advantage of my position. Well, no, hang on, I've got one for you. How much of the issue is COVID, and how much is the deliberate cutting back of the state by government?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's almost academic, actually, in the face of COVID. But clearly, we've had well, a decade pretty much of austerity. You know, the government didn't muck about. David Cameron went on television after the banking crisis and told everybody that we're going to be cutting back. And there are those students of conservative history will note that there was a notion that GDP should be public spending should never be more than 20% of GDP. That was a kind of a conservative's goal, political goal, right? And you could argue that the banking crisis allowed them to push that. I actually, my personal view is that we weren't prepared for the crisis, largely because of the cutbacks in public services. If you look at what happened to public health year on year before the pandemic, I don't think I make any political points. These are facts. You can see the cutbacks in public health in the years before the pandemic. That can't have been the best platform on which to manage the greatest crisis in public health there's ever been. Similarly, you could say for most public services, from the police. So there is a challenge. Having said that, and if you look at what's happened to local government, that's had, you know, decimated, you know, 60 pence in every pound has been slashed out of the local government budget. Having said all that, and I was not in favour of austerity, and I'm still not in favour of austerity. Having said all that, there is the requirement for us to change the way we do things and not just ask for more money. So even with limited resources, I still think that there is a case for more effective and more efficient services to the public.
So, on that, there's a number of questions around the whole thing of how do we make the sector more visible politically? How do we organize to get that systems approach that you talk about? How do we advocate for this role? Any immediate thoughts on that? And I should imagine that's something participants can also contribute to.
Yeah.
Any top line thoughts from you?
Yeah. So there are the following things that I think are necessary as principles. One, never confuse access with influence. In other words, getting to go to government meetings with ministers doesn't mean that you influence them, but actually understanding, and this is going to sound a bit odd, but understanding their concerns. So, for instance, Social Enterprise UK is doing work on with the Business Action Council on how do we build back better in terms of employment. Social enterprises for every one job, for £100,000 of investment, social enterprises produce 3.5 jobs. 4 dividend businesses produce 1 job for £100,000 of investment, right? So we're making the case that actually supporting social enterprises meets the challenge around not just, because I know that we've got vacancy challenges here, but it's about the quality of those jobs and about their reaching to the communities in need. We know that social enterprises are more likely to employ people that look like me, are more likely to work in areas of poverty, are more likely to. So first of all, it's about getting the facts together that meet the demands of the current economic and political context. Secondly, I think being bold about making the arguments, not just singularly, but together. This is the system leadership, like pulling together, and the work, some of the work NPCs are doing now, indeed this conference is an indicator of how that might happen. 3, I think, don't be afraid to get political, small p. I mean, I'm a crossbencher, right? I'm not a member of any political party. I think the Charities Act, I said it in the House, it has had a chilling effect on charities and organisations' ability to campaign, but it shouldn't stop it, right? I think my view is that MPs have never been more sensitive, actually, to lobbying than now, but you have to be more organised and structured about how you do it. So it's the facts, it's the actually working together on key themes and key messages, and it's in engaging politicians in their places, in their communities, and mobilising. And I think that's possible.
Thank you, Victor. There are a lot more questions, but I think there are a lot of questions about systems leadership. I'm going more in detail into that, but the NPC team have told me they will share some links on that, and they'll be doing some work on that. And also, I think you've touched on some of the questions about political influence and lobbying, but we'll capture all your questions, participants, and take those forward. And I'm sure you can come back to the team on any specifics if you want to either input or access material or information. Victor, thank you very much. Any final words you want to say to us for this deliberation?
No, well, I always say this at times like this. Everybody on this call is far, far, far too lucky to be pessimistic. And the people that we need to do this work for aren't on this call. They're the people outside this room, and they owe it. We owe it to them to get our act together, to show the leadership, and to move the needle towards better and more sustainable. I'll end there. Thank you for the opportunity. Very nice to see you, Albert.
Thank you, Victor. Yeah, and we must catch up again.
Absolutely. You're looking damn cool. Speak to you soon.
Thank you, Victor.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your questions and your participation. Just moving on, because I'm quite aware of time. We've got 2 of the team, Seth Reynolds, who is Principal Consultant for Systems Change. And Seth has a very, very deep experience of working on systems and internationally. And so Seth will be, and Leah Davis. Leah heads up NPC policy and external affairs work. And it's also about communicating and influencing on our policies and new policies to improve the impact of the sector, as well as long experience in the field. So without any more ado, I want to hand over to Leah and Seth.
Thanks very much, Albert, and good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Does it sound okay? Great, fantastic, thank you. Well, thank you so much, even though he's gone, in his absence, Lord Victor, for that explosive start. I definitely drew the short straw in having to follow that. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about getting into some of the detail of NPC's Rethink Rebuild program, why we started it, what we've been doing, and what we've been hearing. And then Leah will share some of the detail about the specific pieces of work that have been and are being developed through that. There's a model that we use in systems thinking, which you should be able to see on your screen, yes, called the iceberg model, which some of you may have come across, especially if you've been to some of my sessions or use it a lot. It uses the iceberg as a metaphor to consider the deeper systemic patterns, behaviors, relationships, and beliefs that give rise to the things that we see day to day on the events. COVID undoubtedly smashed into that iceberg, and in doing so revealed, shone some fresh light and provided a moment to reflect on some of those deep-lying structural issues that of course were there the whole time, and that were determining how the events on the surface were playing out. So we, along with many others in the sector, knew that this provided a unique opportunity to examine those systemic drivers and try and take a moment to rethink how we work and how we could work differently. Next slide, please. None of this, obviously, is to underplay the extent of the crisis, as we've heard, the incredible strain that many parts of the sector were and are under. It was and is both an opportunity and a crisis, not an either-or thing. And what we wanted to understand was how this shock to the system was causing shifts in our sort of shared landscape, and what kind of responses were being developed, and we've been hearing some of those already. There's always a risk with these kinds of system shocks or system shifts that they revert, because that's what systems do. They tend to revert if left to their own devices. Some things inevitably would revert, and some of course should and must. But we also wanted to be intentional in considering how to, which of those system shifts we wanted to kind of keep, which we wanted to turn into systems change, or we believed should, and which should indeed revert, or to borrow another metaphor, what baggage we should leave behind from this experience and what luggage we should take with us. Next slide, please. So very briefly, this is what we did. We decided to do this process in the open, conscious that we did not have the answers. We need to hear from people across the sector with different perspectives and different insights to what we can bring. So we spoke to over 325 organisations through interviews, workshops, roundtables, peer network groups, and so on. We published seeds of some of our ideas on our NPC Lab site that some of you may have seen, and we provided this space for others, the ideas of others as well. We had a launch event back in March and heard from 4 leading thinkers about what they thought should be driving our collective rebuild. And some of these things have been touched on already, so I won't spend too long. If you can go on to the next slide, please. Common themes continually merged really across these conversations and platforms, such as these here: greater equity, greater flexibility and trust, more adaptive, agile, decentralized practices, greater collaboration, of course, greater systemic awareness and action and leadership, as we've heard. So we began to explore these topics and how they might take form in our day-to-day work. How, it's easy to kind of say we must do these things. How do we do them? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And how do we start to kind of road test some of these different ways of working? So I'm going to hand over now to our Head of Policy and External Affairs, Leah Davis, to expand on those topics.
Thank you, Seth. As Seth mentioned, we focused on 5 big cross-sector challenges that together we think can transform the sector so that it can work even better for our people and our communities. And the first change that we looked at was equity in collaboration. Now, people often talk about the virtues of collaboration, and they also talk about the need to address harmful power dynamics within the sector. And I think those are things that a lot of us will support as general principles. But through this project, we explored how to take them from principles to something that's actually practical and happens. That is where equity in collaboration comes in. Talking to charities and funders, we found that too often collaborations are within trusted circles and among familiar faces. And if you're in an organisation that is denied access to power and resources, like those from some minoritized groups, you just aren't invited to be part of some collaborations. And even when you are, the collaboration is inequitable, with groups feeling like their involvement could sometimes be so simply tokenistic. So we need to make collaborations more equitable. And to do that, we need to include a broader and diverse range of organisations. For example, grant makers funding equity and inclusion partners to strengthen the design and reach of their programmes. We need to acknowledge existing power imbalances. We need to agree new structures and ways of working to address these, probably most importantly, such as ensuring fair payment or developing power sharing models where partners elect lead organisations to coordinate services. And we need to make it the norm. We and the people we spoke to as part of Rethink Rebuild are not naive. We know that this will require big shifts across charities and funders, a shift that haven't been made in decades. But with the right tools and building on work that's already happening, we think it can make our sector more equitable and our collaborations much more effective. The second change we looked at was moving from shared data to shared intelligence. When COVID hit, there was a scramble for information and data on which people in which parts of the country needed what support. And quite frankly, it highlighted some gaping holes in the structures we use to share data and intelligence to target support. New data sharing groups did spring up in response, but much of this was based on government and backward-looking and fairly static data. It lacked real-time data and local intelligence and knowledge from charities, which build up the real picture of what is really happening on the ground. And it meant support just wasn't being targeted as effectively as it could have been. It showed the need for us to move from shared data to shared intelligence. And under shared intelligence, we would see groups of organisations from across sectors, including government, charities and businesses, agreeing to share intelligence on a given priority. Official statistics and other static data being combined with more real-time data and using on-the-ground intelligence from charities and businesses and other feedback or changes that they're noticing in their communities. Making sure that data and intelligence can generate practical and usable information, and importantly, enabling lower capacity groups to easily access, use and understand the intelligence that's gathered. And to be clear, this isn't just for when or if another pandemic hits. This intelligence can be critical in lots of different areas. For example, a complex issue like knowing where financial hardship is rapidly worsening. And there are some great examples of where this is already starting to happen. And by building on these and making shared intelligence far more common, we think charities and funders can create a shift in how they target their support. The third area we looked at was system strategies, which is great that Victor mentioned that. Charities and funders often develop their strategies by placing themselves at the centre of it. And if your purpose is to maintain an organisation, this makes a lot of sense. But it's generally not the best way of achieving a mission or changing systems that create the challenges that many charities seek to solve. Because no one single organisation working alone can ever achieve its mission. No one homelessness charity can end homelessness, nor can one conservation charity protect a natural habitat from the complex range of forces that threaten it. And although collaborative working does happen within specific projects or response to a particular opportunity, it's generally not built into central strategic planning. And this is where system strategies comes in. By adopting a more systemic approach to strategy development, charities and funders would firstly have to have greater humility and honesty about their role, their limitations, and their interdependence with others in the system. They need to work together with other organisations that are trying to change the same systems, developing strategies together rather than in isolation. But they could work on a spectrum of activities with other organisations. At the more basic end, they could work on their own systems map to inform their strategy. And at the more advanced end, using shared systems analysis tools between organisations as setting an agreed set of shared objectives. We know that asking organisations not to put themselves at the centre of the strategy process is probably one of the biggest and possibly most difficult changes we're suggesting as part of Rethink Rebuild, but we also think it's one of the most necessary. The fourth area we looked at was on policy and a new social recovery. COVID has exposed the social inequalities that have existed for many years, indeed decades in this country, and I think Victor articulated a lot of those really very well. Economic policy measures like building physical infrastructure like roads and new offices are not going to be enough on their own to rebuild this country and address our multiple social inequalities. We need to invest much more in social policies, but we also need to recognise and empower charities to play their part in the recovery. Many charities exist to address the social challenges that COVID has exposed, from homelessness and loneliness through to racial inequalities. And their knowledge, their relationships and the services that they deliver will all be necessary for our country's recovery. In short, we need a new social recovery that focuses on social needs and is delivered with charities. Earlier this year, we published our view on how government's levelling up agenda can be strengthened to ensure we get a social recovery. That report, called Should We Level Up Social Needs, recommended that for a new social recovery, we need to free up local councils and charities to target funding to communities and people where greatest social recovery is required, to build charities and local partners into local social recovery plans. So, for example, local levelling up route maps should be produced by all local authorities receiving over £30 million of levelling up funding. And that should explain how they're going to work with and empower the voluntary and community sector to help deliver a local social recovery. And they should help charities and funders to align and target their funding in different areas by better sharing of data. Now, there are already lots of local groups, think tanks and charities campaigning in this area. But if we want to make sure that this results in change, we need to act together and we need to act fast. Now, the final area we looked at was on impact measurement for flexible funding. During the pandemic and beforehand, we saw a positive shift towards more trust-based philanthropy, providing more flexible and unrestricted funding. And funders and charities told us that this meant they could give the right help to people when they needed it during the pandemic. But whilst there was lots of progress on the first half of the grant making cycle, the making and managing of grants, there was less on the second half of the cycle of the impact measurement and learning. We spoke to many people who felt that in the rush towards greater flexibility, measuring and understanding impact had, quite understandably, taken a back seat, and some were resistant to even talk about impact measurement. We think this poses a real threat to the effectiveness of philanthropy. For most funders, impact measurement is one of the key feedback loops that drives grant-making decisions. So we can't rethink grant-making without rethinking the way we measure impact and learn from our grants. New approaches to one doesn't mean we should disregard the other, but it does mean that we may need new approaches to it. At MPC, we have always advocated for appropriate measurement of the impact of grants, but we think this needs to go further. We need to review the sector's existing impact measurement tools and practices to make sure they work in this new age of funding. We need to review how charities developed impact measurement approaches that can meet a range of funders' needs as well as their own. We need to look at how funders can keep demands on grantees light and proportional whilst accessing the information that they need. And they need to find out whether different approaches are needed for different types or sizes of grants and for different charities in different sectors. And to help the sector navigate this, we'll need better frameworks, tools and resources. And we want to work with charities and funders to do this review. And ultimately, we think this will help a lot of the really positive trust-based approaches to become mainstream. Now, these are all approaches. They aren't everyday practical changes, but are also going to be needed, and which many charities have been focused on, not only for the past 18 months, but for many will continue to be a focus. They're also not all new. They build on a lot of work and ideas that are already happening or just starting, but we think they have the potential to be adopted much more widely. They're also purposefully not exhaustive. For example, our proposed changes don't include climate change. It just wasn't possible to cover everything in this project. But COVID has shone a light on the challenges we face in the sector. And we think these 5 changes have the potential to be a critical part of the transformation that is needed to make us a stronger and more effective sector for our people and our communities. We're aware that not every charity and funder will have the capacity, and it may not be right for them to be involved in shaping what happens next with these 5 changes. But for those of you who are, we would like to invite you to work with us on pilots and developing tools and new alliances to help make these proposed changes a reality. If you'd like to get involved, you can find out more on our website and also take part in the roundtables in the second part of this event. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Leah. Moving swiftly on, because I am very mindful of time, but actually, from those presentations we've heard and from what Victor was saying, there's a lot of talk about collaboration, data, intelligence, and measuring. And to misquote my comments whenever I see the intelligence word is, but by all means necessary as long as it's intelligent. And that moves me swiftly onto our 2 panelists. The first of whom will be Dr. Kaneez Shaid, Head of Community Engagement at Rethink Mental Illness. Kaneez has been the chair of Citizens UK and Living Wage Foundation, where she led Britain's largest civil alliance, representing over 500,000 people in 600 member organizations, and has been involved very much in social justice and campaigning work for over 20 years. I also know Shanice does some amazing presentations of impact and measurement. So Shanice, over to you. If you could give us 5 to 7 minutes, please, and we'll go to questions later.
Okay, but can I just ask you to remove the PowerPoint? I'm just going to talk for a little while and then we'll switch to PowerPoint. Thank you. I'm going to switch the timer on for myself. Good morning all, and thank you, Albert, for inviting me to come along and speak. My name is Kaneez Shaid. I am the head of community engagement at Rethink Mental Illness. Before we dive into Rethink, it's worth just saying that we are not perfect and that we recognise that mental illness is on the rise, and we are running to keep up with what is unfolding, and we are constantly learning. So Rethink Mental Illness is a charity for people severely affected by mental illness. For example, people diagnosed with schizophrenia, bipolar and personality disorders. Its mission is to lead the way for a better quality of life for beneficiaries, carers, families and friends. It's a campaigning organisation that has two sort of parts to it. So it also provides lots of services. We have about 3 million people that access our helplines, advocacy services, but also about 15,000 people who are cared for in our QCQ run services. And they are the supported housing, crisis houses, and also the prisons that we run. The charity will turn 50 next year, and it started in 1972 with a father who wrote about his son who's diagnosed with schizophrenia, Mr. John Pringle, and that got an outpouring of letters from other carers that really resonated with that. And the community began to grow, and the organisation was founded. So today, Rethink works across the UK and it employs about 900 members of staff. So the question is, how did COVID impact Rethink Mental Illness? Well, COVID created a lot of movement, and it led to a mixture of some positive and some negative impacts for us. Really, it changed rules and it changed structures and it changed the way we behave. People living with mental illness were heavily impacted by the changes to mental health services in particular. Lockdown caused deterioration to people's mental health because of the sudden change to routine, but also the removal of coping mechanisms and not being able to see loved ones. That had a huge impact on them. About 58%, like more than half, said that mental health support had worsened. Plus the social distancing rules impact behaviours, caused anxiety and panic and loneliness across our beneficiaries. The helplines obviously saw an increase in self-harm, substance abuse, assault, death, and cases became much more complex. Carers were now re-engaging for support. Prisoners were staying much longer in prisons than they needed to, and misery for tenants whose landlords were unable to repair the properties. Some of the statutory services just fell away. The mechanisms to report fell away. Some psychiatric wards closed. Access and disruption was caused to obviously the flow of medication, and that had an impact on us. That rule to get people off the street just created a huge surge in our referrals for Rethink's accommodation services. And the rule about what places should stay open and what should close meant community spaces just reduced or permanently just shut down, like the job centre. Vital community drop-in spaces and safe spaces like church halls and mosques that provided hot meals, they just fell away. And the rules on travel and social distance changed and shifted the way we work. And as many of you, we shifted our teams and peer support groups and services to telephone and virtual spaces and online services. Some of our beneficiaries obviously had no access to IT, so they were locked out of those systems as well. New structures of working formed, new relationships, new conversations, new trust, and in some cases it sparked innovation, collaboration, insights, and sharing of resources and free spaces. We had lots of examples. For example, the Rethink Crisis House created new pathways for its beneficiaries between them and NHS institutions. Two other examples, one is in Somerset. We were working with an alliance of 10 different voluntary organisations and an NHS trust. And in about just a week, we implemented a 24/7 helpline for about 30 minutes of emotional support with a warm transfer to local specialist intervention people. And that was a brilliant collaboration. Over in Grimsby, Rethink Mental Illness worked with another NHS provider and a social enterprise and recruited COVID-19 navigators who identified people living with mental illness who had stopped accessing services. And that service prevented vulnerable people reaching a crisis point. So there was lots of change, but there was change to the way money was flying around. Some money got cut, some became very freely available. The funders were more trusting. We saw some unrestricted funding coming in, and that enabled for example, Rethink to now run a much needed QCQ funded safety hub for BAM community. Okay, we're just going to skip over to 5 slides now. If I could just ask you to, Rebecca, put up the first one. Next one. So the question is, what did we learn? I don't know if you can lift that up a tiny fraction. If not, don't worry. So what we learned is that COVID disrupted our rules and structures and behaviors. You've got 3 different types of triangles there. And I think COVID was a bit like that mole in the middle. It was really disruptive and messy and an unexpected force that arrived. The question is, did rigid systems like that pyramid we see there, was it impacted by COVID more? And were systems which are like that volcano on the right-hand side more agile and able to adapt? If so, maybe that volcano just there teaches us something about how we might build back more equitably. Can we go to the next slide, please? COVID also felt like a really powerful kinetic energy. Some systems couldn't move like the ice cube, and others sadly disappeared. But some took on a liquid form, like our 135 peer support groups at Rethink. They adapted their rules, changed their structures, changed their behaviors, and acted together collectively for the common good. Maybe liquid teaches us something about how we can come together and be more effective. Slide 3, please. All right, so this one is about values, and Rethink Mental Illness has just added equity, I can't say that word, equity is a value. And that is just, maybe it's like a drop that falls into an ocean and it rediscovers that it's actually part of something much greater than itself. Maybe, therefore, letting go of some things and recognizing others teaches us about how to build back more effectively. Slide 4. Okay, in other organizations I've worked at, they have really organized power and decision-making intentionally. And they have worked out how different parts of the organization can function together inside and outside. These are very grassroots, bottom-up types of models. Maybe earthly models like this bicycle and tree can teach us something about how we can build back more effectively. And finally, the last slide, please. Of course, it's a rainbow. Rethink Mental Illness is creating place-based alliances. It's just set up a community mental health unit to facilitate local integrated care systems. It's working with the NHS and local authorities and local charity organizations on the ground. We know Black and Asian communities were more likely to die from COVID. Many of the small grassroots organizations really suffered during lockdown. These communities were not traditionally invested in. And our unit is working to address some of those inequalities. Mini grants are now reaching those communities through that unit's work. Relationships are forming with institutional leaders on the ground. Community assets are being joined up, and the new co-production tools we're using are being invented and piloted. And we hope that some of this work we're doing, which puts the voice of people with lived experience at the very, very heart of the work, is how we're going to transform the health sector and help Rethink build back more equitably. Okay.
Thank you, Kaneez, and thanks for your tight timekeeping. So on to our next speaker, Juliet Mountain, Director of the Shaid Trust. Juliet has a great experience in foundation and philanthropic advocacy and communications, and has very strong objectives about maximizing our charitable outcomes. And I hope incomes, Juliet. Juliet has worked within the charity, government, and business sectors, from startups to multinationals, and is very experienced in communication, marketing and engagement, human-centered design, organizational and sustainable development, venture philanthropy and innovation. And Juliet, over to you.
Thanks, Albert. Yes, gosh, how to follow up what Kaneez has just said and what Victor said. It's just been fantastic listening to everyone and learning. And actually, that's my almost starting point. You know, what Victor was saying about listening and active listening, it's absolutely critical. In my view, to lead is to listen. It's about knowing that you don't know all the answers. And that's really the key to bridging the kind of, we're talking about rethink, rebuild. Actually, it's about knowing what needs to change by listening to what needs to change. But there's also, it's then how do you learn how to make that change happen? And that's the bit where often, in my experience, most organizations get stuck. And an organization is a system, and actually when you take that larger to sort of extended enterprises and ecosystems, and that's sort of from collaboration to cooperation, how do you make that shift? So that's something that we're very much actively exploring through the Shaid Trust Foundation. So just to give you a bit of background, so Shaid Trust is about 40 years old. We deliver, our mission is to make good work accessible to all, regardless of life circumstances. And the way we do that is by providing integrated child to career services and good help to enable people to overcome the barriers that they face and be able to access what they need to progress their prospects in life. So we deliver everything from family and fostering services and children's homes through to, we run multi-academy schools trusts. We do a lot of NEET and pre-NEET provision, health and wellbeing support, and learning and skills. So we run traineeships, employment and employability programs on behalf of the government, as well as a number of social enterprises. So one of the things that we're learning about ourselves as an organisation, as a system, is how do we better layer and integrate our services so that we are creating the social infrastructure within our own organisation to deliver for today, to deliver for today's needs, and aggregate the outcomes of those multiple touch points across organisations. The foundation has been set up to design for tomorrow. So we are the sort of innovation hub, if you like, the innovation incubator. We're all about piloting and prototyping new and different ways to solve some of society's problems in terms of addressing some of those inequalities. And where there are gaps in our provision, that is where we're looking to layer on additional support, because the majority of our work is commissioned by national and local government. And as we know, that doesn't always fulfill all the needs of everyone in society. So our approach is very much to work in partnership with others in order to co-create the system of solutions that is needed. So to go back to the point about systems, so every system orientates itself around a purpose. So if it's a company, that purpose is generally to make profit. In our case, as a social enterprise with charitable status, and for most of you on the call, I'm guessing, actually, generally, if you chunk up what we're all trying to achieve, it's basically the same purpose, which is enabling people to live their best life, participate socially, and contribute economically. So if we've all got that shared purpose, that's the anchor that will enable us to orientate ourselves around a system where we can collaborate rather than compete. I think one of the things that I know often gets in the way is mission drift. Having worked as a venture philanthropist with many charities over the years, I think it's very easy to follow the money and not necessarily always sort of follow the mission. And so you get mission drift. Actually, if we can be really honest with ourselves and say, are we sort of, in order to cooperate, we need to create that non-competitive environment. So I'm just going to go on to, I'm conscious of time, some of the areas specific around Rethink, Rebuild, and what we're doing as an organisation to try and learn how to rebuild and build new ways of working together. So funding and measurement is one of the themes. We're looking at actually how we apply that design thinking process to everything that we do. So we're always trying to understand what the unmet need is from the perspective of those who have the lived experience of that need, but also the lived experience of trying to resolve that need. So other charities and organisations that are working in those spaces. What's the challenge that is getting in the way? So why is it that need is not being fulfilled? What are the blockers? How do we almost like apply a social model that's used in disability to making all of the good help that is available out there accessible to all through effective social infrastructure and social infrastructure working and partnering? And then what are the assets in the system that we can utilize? And when I say the system, a problem worth solving. So you know, I mentioned actually the common purpose that we all have. That common purpose is also a complex problem worth solving, but it's not just worth solving by us. It is worth solving by industry. It is worth solving by government. It is a cross-sector problem. If we're looking at addressing the inequalities that have been exacerbated by COVID, and we're talking about equity, actually, it's also about mutuality around co-investing and co-producing the solutions to that, mobilizing the assets that are available within the system to do that. So we're looking at a blended capitals model for how we invest into charities, but also enable others to co-invest into that social infrastructure, building that social infrastructure. So it's not just the money, it's about the human capital, the knowledge sharing. You know, how do we value that in such a way that we're not only looking at it from the input and investment perspective, but also the outcome perspective as well. So it's not just about sort of how many people are you helping, or, you know, some of the simple metrics that we might use. It's actually, we need to look at it from a multi-dimensional perspective. So an outcome for one individual would be very different to an outcome for another. How do we account for that, for those outcomes, and the difference that has made in progressing someone's prospects in life? Self-assessment is one tool that we're looking at doing that. So, but how do you aggregate all of those different steps, individual steps that every person that we work with has made? Place, inclusive growth. How do we leverage, dynamically use the assets in place in order to deliver the right outcomes? And then prosperity. What are those multi-dimensional aspects around poverty? Because there is, with every single individual that you all work with, there is never one challenge that they face. There are usually multiple challenges. So actually, in order for us to demonstrate the value of the work that we do in addressing all of those multiple challenges, you need a multi-dimensional approach to the aggregate outcomes that you're able to deliver for those individuals. So in addition to that blended capitals model, the other thing in terms of system, moving on to system strategy that we're looking at, is affiliate framework. So actually, in working with other charities, we know we cannot do it all ourselves within Shaid Trust. Neither do we want to. That just wouldn't be right. What we want to do is develop a affiliated model whereby we bring other charities, social enterprises, VCSEs into our extended enterprise, so that we can learn from them, they can learn from us, they can access some of our central support, which is often one of the issues around helping organisations to build their capacity for growth and their capacity to help more people and provide more good help. So it's about bringing them into our extended enterprise and offering them the support beyond, you know, as venture philanthropy is great, and, you know, but it usually ends up telling people what they need to do differently, not working collectively to do things differently together, or utilizing the resources that we have. So so that's one of the things that we are looking at, and in order to sort of layer that specialist expertise that partner organizations can bring that we don't have, to address some of the specific inequalities that and barriers to progression that our participants experience. Okay. And then around equitable collaboration, power with versus power over is absolutely key to our model. So even just simple things like naming conventions. So our employees are not employees, they're colleagues. We have a collegiate approach to the way that we work together. We don't work with beneficiaries. They are not benefiting from, they are participating. They are participants, they are participating, and they have an active voice in the way that we co-design and co-develop our services. And our partners are not suppliers. It's not us buying something. We are strategic partners. So these might sound like really simple kind of just words, but actually it's so much more than that. Sorry, Albert, I'm going over time, aren't I?
No, but just wrap up. Just why not wrap it up?
So I guess, there's an awful lot that we are doing to learn how to bridge that gap between knowing what needs to happen differently, and learning how to actually make that happen. And for me, I think it's the shift between collaboration to cooperation, which means a new target operating model in place that is sensitive to the individual needs of the people in that place, sensitive to the specific context of that place, that has the ability to be scalable, so that we take the lessons learned in one place and can scale and share those in other places, and is both socially and economically valuable. That's really key. It's not just about the social value that we generate. It needs to be, we need to be able to demonstrate as a sector, as VCSEs, the economic value of what we bring to society as well, in order for us to have a seat at the table, because at the end of the day, money still talks. So it's really key that we're able to demonstrate that. So that's my final word, Albert, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. From the discussion, there's something that emerged for me, one of the things about language and how we use language. Victor talked about how the sector is described. You've talked about this, and Kaneez talked about how the definitions around mental health. And I think that's an area I hadn't thought about before. So we'll go to questions for both of you. We've got a couple of questions. One is, how do we put these ideas into practice? The question what comes next? But I think the what comes next can be discussed in the breakout groups we're going to. Or maybe if you could throw one thought about how we put these ideas into practice from each of you, starting with Kaneez.
Yeah, language, I just picked that one up. It's a brilliant one. Change and shift language. Don't call people beneficiaries, call them participants. Don't call them, individuals with wants, but actually realize that they are people that have power and can, be part of that focus. I think language is a really important one. We in our work in the past, we call everybody a leader. Doesn't matter who you are, you're a leader. You can, affect and bring change. And we don't see our staff as staff. We see them as people who scout for leaders. And we have a whole load of tools that we use. The most important one is a one-to-one, which is just a conversation. It's a 45-minute human conversation. Who are you? Not, here's my agenda, and this is what I want to talk to you about, but it's relational. It's very human contact. And that's some of the work we're doing in the place-based work. But relationships are really important. Language is really important.
So on those people being leaders, Kaneez, you might want to read a book by Juliet Mountain called Leadership Beyond Authority, which will be interesting. Juliet?
Yeah, as I said, I think in my experience and just going out and visiting our frontline services, that those relational anchors in place are there often, but they're almost taken for granted. So if I go back to the sort of economic value that we generate, it's like, oh, well, we just do that. Well, yeah, of course we reach out to other organisations who are in this place to provide the wraparound support that every individual that we work with needs, because we care deeply about helping someone get on and get up in life. But it's almost, I think sometimes these things are taken for granted, and actually we need to pay attention to what works and the difference that we're already making, and learn from that and amplify it and be able to measure it. So the point I didn't get around to is, actually data and intelligence, that listening to what works and what's needed, and constantly evolving and adapting the approach to that, but also having the data to help make well-informed choices, but also to help commissioners make those well-informed choices. So the policy bit is really key as well, because actually if we can demonstrate the value in all the stuff that we often take for granted because we just do it, then actually you can amplify our voice at the table when it comes to policy, because we can demonstrate not just the social value, but the economic value that we contribute.
Okay, and one last question. I think the other questions can be taken into the breakout groups, including this one really, but maybe just a top line thoughts from you, quick thoughts from you on this. How can we encourage funders to reward learning and change based on data rather than meeting set targets? Any immediate thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, Juliet. I was just going to say, it's faith, isn't it? When you put a seed in the ground, you don't guarantee that something's going to grow. You have faith. And I think a lot of our work is listening and just letting go of some of that power and having faith that the community will come back with solutions, and they know better than we do. And so we plant just relationships, we plant time, and we plant space to have conversations. And then we sit back and we wait for something really amazing to flourish from it. So I think faith.
All
yeah,
right.
and I would build on that and just say, actually, I worked in John Lewis Partnership for a number of years, which, as many of you will know, is the UK's only industrial democracy. Now, as a co-owned business, actually, a lot of those principles are really key to the way that I think we need to work. It's about co-ownership, and it's about devolution of decision making, and equipping people with the knowledge to make those well-informed decisions. So the sharing of knowledge and power is really critical in the way that their systems are structured.
Great, thank you very much. And now I'll bring this really interesting discussion to a close.